DNA, genealogy testing, and other forensic advancements are all incredibly helpful tools for scientists and members of law enforcement. Such reliable testing is necessary to put criminals behind bars. But despite how far we've come in our technological advancements, sometimes it just isn't enough, and perpetrators slip through the cracks. In today's episode, we'll be taking a look at a few such cases as we examine 3 decades-old cold cases that are still unsolved in 2024. Mary Margaret Cook. 25-year-old Mary Margaret Cook was last seen on November 14th, 1970. Mary was a married mother of 2 at the time of her disappearance, having tied the knot with her husband, Lethen Earl Cook, 8 years earlier, when she was just 17. A stay-at-home mother, Mary kept the couple's house up to spec and cared for the children, while Earl earned his living as a painter. He would often leave the couple's home in Highland City, Florida, and travel during the week for various jobs before returning for the weekend. Mary was last seen leaving the couple's residence in Highland City to go Christmas shopping at the J.M. Fields store in Lakeland, but she never returned. According to her Doe Network page, she had backed out of a family camping trip that weekend because her husband had called to tell her he'd be home. Mary's vehicle, a white 1959 Cadillac, was found abandoned in the store's car park the day after she was last seen, and shortly after she was reported missing. It contained her wallet and handbag, but the $200 Earl claimed to have given her for the presents was missing. Additionally, Mary's wedding rings were found at the house. This was unusual as she wore them every day and rarely removed them. Investigators were unable to find any witnesses. It seemed that the 25-year-old had never entered the store. Law enforcement has been very open about the fact they consider Mary's husband, Earl, the prime suspect in her case, though they've never been able to concretely tie him to the disappearance. Over the years, he has been extensively interviewed, and in 2003, authorities dug up the garage floor of the house the couple lived in 1970, searching for clues. Police reported, "We believe there's a possibility that Miss Cook may have been disposed of in her yard." No evidence was found, however. Earl, meanwhile, maintains his innocence. He told their 2 young boys, aged 3 and 5 when Mary vanished, that their mother had left of her own volition. He remarried 2 years after Mary went missing. Eventually, that marriage dissolved, and he married a 3rd time shortly afterwards. He died in 2007, aged 66. Despite Earl's stories, neither of the children believe that their mother just up and left for a new life. Their eldest son has told investigators that he saw his parents arguing on the day of the disappearance. He also recalled that, at one point, his father told him not to look outside. He has theorized that his mother's body was concealed in a red blanket, which he saw his father retrieve from the house. Following Mary's disappearance, the boys stayed with their maternal grandmother. However, when she found out Earl was under investigation, she confronted him and bluntly asked if he'd killed her daughter. Earl, though, didn't reply. Instead, he took the children and left. In the years since, there has been some speculation that Mary's disappearance is linked to that of another young mother, Peggy Byers Baisden. 23-year-old Peggy went missing from Highland City on April 2nd, 1965, after heading out to a bar. She was reportedly seen in the bar's car park that evening, accompanied by an unidentified white man, and was having car trouble. Both Peggy and her vehicle have been missing ever since. Peggy was divorced when she disappeared and was working as a waitress. Her children were raised by her sister and brother-in-law after she went missing. Investigators have never identified a suspect. Despite the two women having some similarities, they were of similar ages, lived in the same city, were both mothers, and both had vanished after leaving their homes. Nothing further has linked these two cases. Authorities do not believe the two women knew each other, and Mary's case seems much more open and shut compared to Peggy's. 25-year-old Mary Cook was last seen in Highland City, Florida on November 14, 1970. She is described as a half-white, half-Native American woman with brown hair and blue or hazel eyes. She is 4'11" and weighed around 145 to 150 pounds when she disappeared. She was possibly wearing a green dress when she went missing. Mary requires glasses to see and often wears cat eye frames, and she has a birthmark on the outside of her right leg above her ankle. Her Charlie Project and Doe Network pages note that she may have been pregnant when she went missing. If you have any information about Mary's disappearance, or that of Peggy, you can leave a tip with the Polk County Crime Stoppers at 1-800-226-8477, or call the Polk County Sheriff's Office at 800-226-0344. Melvin and Florence Shoemaker. The case of Florence Shoemaker, a 76-year-old woman who vanished from Ravenna, Ohio in February of 2003, is a strange one indeed, especially when you consider that her ex-husband, Melvin, disappeared almost a decade earlier in 1994. Melvin Shoemaker was last seen in Parkman, Ohio on April 11, 1994. Though he took his wallet and keys, he left behind most of his other personal possessions, including his vehicles. According to the Charlie Project, Melvin had a strained relationship with the couple's son, Glenn Roger Shoemaker. Less than 2 decades earlier, in 1978, Melvin noted in a diary that he had almost been fired from his job after his son and wife had locked him inside the house and forbidden him from going to work. He wrote that he was, quote, tied up and chained in the basement at times during the month. On one occasion, he was able to escape, but his son caught him up and sprayed him in the face with mace. Glenn subsequently threatened to kill him and hide his body somewhere where it could never be found. That same year, Melvin and Florence separated and eventually divorced. Police have noted that there are allegations that Melvin abused Florence prior to their split. Melvin was living alone at the time of his disappearance in April of 1994. Neighbors recalled that he lived a hermit-like life. He had no telephone and no television, but he was polite and generous with his neighbors and enjoyed helping the community. Though neighbors told the police after 6 days that they hadn't seen Melvin, who was 70 in 1994, it has been noted that Glenn declined to report his father missing for some time. Police checked out Melvin's home, but found it to be in order. There was no sign of a struggle, nor any evidence of a break-in. As previously mentioned, the vast majority of his belongings remained in the home. Just his wallet and keys were missing. He left behind around $700,000 in assets. Several months after Melvin vanished, investigators searched Glenn's home for evidence. They found 11 guns and a massive amount of ammunition, and search dogs also alerted officers to 3 spots in the basement floor, a sign that something may have been buried there. Despite this, the basement floor was never excavated. Florence, meanwhile, was last seen on February 3, 2003, in Ravenna, Ohio. She was reportedly much closer with her son than Melvin was, and even lived with him at this time. But despite this, he failed to report her missing and told anyone who asked after her that she was out of town taking care of a patient, as she had previously worked as a home health aide. She was only found to be missing when police were unable to contact her while reinvestigating her ex-husband's disappearance in 2005. According to reports, Florence was in poor health at the time she went missing. She was 76 years old, often appeared unkempt, and struggled to get around by herself. Law enforcement is unsure as to whether or not Florence and Melvin's cases are related, but there is a lot of suspicion that their son, who is now 68, was involved in either one or both of the disappearances. In 2018, Glenn's 40-acre farm property was searched. It seems that little came of this search, but police did notice that despite the fact that Glenn received the bulk of Melvin's assets, he was living with no electricity, no running water, and no telephone. The floors of his home were just dirt, and police reported that he had padlocks on the outside of the doors. The house is said to be in disrepair, inside and out. Melvin Shoemaker has been missing since April 11th, 1994, from Parkman, Ohio. He is described as a white male with graying brown hair and brown eyes. He was 70 when he vanished and had a short beard at the time. He is around 5'9" and weighed between 200 and 250 pounds when he was last seen. His ex-wife, Florence, was last seen on February 3rd, 2003, in Ravenna, Ohio. She is described as a white woman with brown hair and blue eyes. She is 5'7" and was around 155 pounds when she went missing. She was 76 at the time of her disappearance, and her maiden name is Converse. Anyone with information on the disappearance of Melvin Shoemaker or his ex-wife Florence can contact the Portage County Sheriff's Office at 330-296-5100. Terry and Alan Westerfield. 11-year-old Terry Westerfield and his 7-year-old brother Alan were last seen in Fayetteville, North Carolina on September 12, 1964, when their stepfather dropped them off at the Broadway Theatre on Hay Street to see a double feature. The details of how or when they disappeared are murky at best. It's unclear if the boys entered the theatre before going missing, or if they vanished from the streets. Even eyewitness testimony struggles to shed light on the finer case details, as some theatre workers recalled seeing the boys inside, but others didn't. Since they were regular customers at the cinema, they would have been easily recognizable. Investigators interviewed the brothers' stepfather, Carl Bock, just after their disappearance, since he was the last one to have seen them alive. He claimed that he dropped the children off at around 4 p.m., and when he went to pick them up several hours later, at 8 o'clock, he was unable to find them. Notably, however, Bock stated that he waited inside his parked vehicle until 9:30 p.m. He did not get out to search for the children and didn't enter the theatre to ask staff if they'd seen them. It wasn't until later that night, at 2 a.m., that the boys' mother reported them missing. She and Bock were separated at the time. Law enforcement, including Fayetteville police, Fort Bragg authorities, and dozens of others aided in the extensive search for the two young boys. While tip after tip made its way to investigators, no real leads ever emerged. Investigators looked into specific cars seen in specific neighborhoods, including a reportedly strange and unidentified vehicle seen near the boys' home before they went missing, and they interviewed numerous individuals who believed they'd seen the children. Even the FBI were brought in. But still, the disappearance remained a mystery. Investigators found not one scrap of evidence, and the bodies of the boys were never recovered. Just days after the disappearance, the police chief at the time told the Fayetteville Observer, "We've checked every lead we've had, and we're still up against a blank wall." Days passed, then weeks, then months. Eventually, it became years, and there was no trace of the children. Carl Bock, the boys' stepfather, was an army sergeant at the time of the disappearance. He worked as a military police officer at Fort Bragg, but was sent overseas just a year after the children went missing. He and the boys' mother formally divorced shortly afterwards, and he remained unmarried throughout the rest of his life. Investigators have theorized that Bock was involved in the disappearance of Terry and Alan, and have suggested that the two were killed shortly after they went missing. In 2012, authorities attempted to re-interview Bock and even offered a letter of qualified immunity, but Bock declined. He told them, "If I hadn't been in the military police, that would be a pretty good proposition." Investigators later recalled that Bock seemed to be indifferent about the boys and their mother, with one officer noting, "It was clear he was devoid of any emotion in respect to those boys, and really, he was indifferent about Margie as well." The disappearance of the Westerfield brothers is the oldest case involving children in North Carolina. The vast majority of witnesses and those important to the case are now dead, including Terry and Alan's biological father, who was ruled out of the investigation early on and who took his own life in 1978, and their mother, Margie, who, following her divorce from Bock, remarried and relocated to South Carolina, where she died in 2003 at the age of 70. Carl Bock was the last to pass away in 2016 at the age of 93. Similarly, the theatre where the boys disappeared has been demolished in the decades since. Despite the disappointing lack of leads and evidence in the case, Fayetteville police occasionally reopen the file and try to look at the investigation with fresh eyes, searching for a missing piece. Nothing yet has come from their efforts, however. New details emerged about the case in 2018, which puts more stock in the police theory that Carl Bock was responsible for the children's disappearance. According to investigators, the boys had been left with a babysitter on the morning of September 12, 1964, because Margie had a hair appointment. Reportedly, Carl Bock turned up at the house and told the babysitter to leave. The babysitter tried to stall and did so for some time before finally leaving at around 12:30 to 1 p.m. Around this time, 7-year-old Alan was seen riding his bike outside. A neighborhood boy and a friend of the children's went to the door to ask if Terry could come out to play. Bock answered the door and said no, that the 11-year-old was being punished. As mentioned earlier, Bock claimed that he later took the boys to see a double film feature. When Margie came home around an hour and a half later, at around 5:30, Bock was in the house and the boys were gone. The pair argued about Bock sending the babysitter home and him taking the boys out, but Margie didn't suspect that anything was amiss. She went out that night with friends. When she came home at 1 a.m., she argued again with Bock, who asked her if she'd picked the children up from the cinema because he allegedly couldn't find them. Margie phoned the police at 2 a.m. to report the boys missing. During an interview, the one where he was offered a letter of qualified immunity, Bock reportedly stated, "You know I was the last one to see them alive." Many police officers have taken this as a sort of confession, but still, Bock was never charged in connection to the case, and the bodies of Alan and Terry have never been discovered. Terry Westerfield was 11 when he vanished from Fayetteville, North Carolina on September 12, 1964. His brother, Alan, was just 7. Terry is described as being a white male with red hair and blue eyes, freckles on his face, and an appendectomy scar on his abdomen. He's also missing one permanent tooth in his lower jaw. He was 4'7" and weighed around 89 pounds when he vanished. His younger brother, Alan, is described as a white male with sandy brown hair, blue eyes, and a speech impediment. He was 3'10" and weighed around 80 pounds at the time of the disappearance. If you have any information about the disappearances of the Westerfield brothers, you can contact the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office at 910-323-1500. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.